Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy.
We have a very special guest with us today. Dr. Udaibir Das is a former central banker and a senior international policy expert on financial systems, capital markets, and central banking policies. He has worked in different capacities at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements, and the Reserve Bank of India. Mr. Das was intimately involved with the international response to the Asian crisis, the GFC of 2008, and the most recent periods of COVID-19, inflation, and the interest rate shocks. His current focus is on how the ongoing demographic, climatic, and technological transformation is altering the financial landscape and its implications for global practices, governance, and emerging markets. Today, we'll be talking about the global economy and financial policy in the context of post-pandemic world and its spillover effect on emerging market countries like India. Welcome, sir. Welcome to Thinkin Podcast, the podcast club of Kautilya School of Public Policy. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. So, sir, my very first question to you is, what has been the economic and financial impact of COVID and the Ukraine war?
Messy. If in one word I was to summarize, messy. And there is a reason. Let me expand a little bit. So the pandemic triggered a dramatic and somewhat peculiar global economic downturn. Countries faced sharp negative supply and demand shocks together, almost simultaneously. And alongside came deep uncertainty, which became the defining feature of this shock. Nobody knew what's going to happen next. Now, from the policy side, the countries responded splendidly, both on the economic, financial, and social policies. But then, along with COVID came another shock, and then came another shock. So we had a shock after shock after shock, and the result is the deep crisis we are in today. Actually, some like to call it as the confluence of four I's: infection, invasion, inflation, and interest rates. And add to this the climate disasters that are almost happening across the continent with a fair amount of severity in the neighborhood, in India, even here in the West. So it has been a rare phenomenon in modern economic history that so many engines of the global economy are stalling or have stalled almost at once. So the impact, your question, has been negative across almost all economies, almost all sectors, and almost all balance sheets. The global inflation rates have touched their highest in 40 years, and central banks have been raising interest rates, and they will continue to raise interest rates in a synchronous manner, which has not been seen for the past 5 decades. The US dollar is hitting its strongest level since early 2000s. So these forces are collectively driving the gloomy forecasts and creating new strains. I have this sort of a list of things that I tell myself. The path to recovery is foggy. And when there is fog, we all slow down, right? Data, perceptions, market commentaries are all pointing to an uncertain outlook. The global economy is in what someone said, interestingly, facing polycrisis and contending a tsunami of challenges. Most certainly, the way I see the policy making and the policy environment is getting altered. When I say altered, means there is historic fragility, there is fragmentation, there is all kinds of discourse and discussion at the international level on how to alter the global economic governance. Of course, as you know, geopolitics and geoeconomics are both bearing upon policy making. Interestingly, for the last 2-3 decades, or maybe more, there's been a push to support globalization, right? Now, globalization and multilateralism debate is rife. And while all this is being sorted out, what we are finding is that a network of plurilateral arrangements, smaller arrangements, are being set up. And uncertainty is just not allowing policymakers to look medium to long term. Market financial conditions are becoming tight. Countries are facing liquidity problems, and several countries are in a state of insolvency. So many are actually asking, is this going to be the dangerous new normal? Or are we sailing into headwinds? And how long will this journey be? How long will this journey on a ship that is going through the choppy waters be? No one knows. I think what we are trying to say, what the world is trying to say is, come together, muster all your muscle to steady the ship and navigate it, not knowing what lies ahead. Now, one measure of all that I'm saying, because it may be sounding a little alarmist, is that when you look at how much recourse has been made by countries to the global last resort financier, which is the IMF. You go to the IMF only when all other options are closed, market options are closed, internally you cannot manage on your own. You then go to the last resort. The IMF has provided almost $260 billion to 93 countries immediately after COVID. And since the Ukraine war, another 16 countries, about 100 billion have come in. And after the last week's annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank here in Washington, I believe that another 12 to 16 countries have queued up. So you can just see, forget the number, just look at 93 plus 16 plus another 14. They're all coming to say, we have one problem or the other. And this money is separate from the amount that the World Bank or the other MDBs, multilateral development banks, or even some private markets have been providing. So in sum, if I could sort of summarize what I'm trying to say to your question is that from a world of relative predictability, with a long stretch of rules-based framework for international and global economic cooperation, low interest rates, low inflation, we live today in a world with more fragility, higher economic volatility, geopolitical confrontations, and more frequent natural disasters. So frankly, it is a world in which any country, advanced or developing, high income or low income, it can be thrown off course more easily and more often.
That's a fantastic take, sir. So picking up from what you said, the 4 I's that are plaguing the world right now: infection, inflation, interest rates, and invasion. So do you think in this context, has the divergence between the developing and developed countries increased?
I think that's a very, very good question. Lots of people are studying exactly the extent of impact and what the dispersion is of the impact. Remember, I said that all countries have been impacted, but it's not clear whether they have been impacted equally or some less. Now, these continuous and simultaneous shocks, the way we are looking at data, has impacted countries in different ways. You should remember that we live in a planet where there is a high diverse collection of countries that are heterogeneous, but they have some common features that in their own drive their own fragility.
Yeah.
Just to give you a range of countries, because it's important to understand that we live in a community of low-income developing countries, states with medium and high conflict, small states, states with high institutional and social fragility, emerging markets and middle-income countries, and of course, the stalwarts of the post-World War II global order, advanced economies. So you can clearly see that the impact was not between developed and developing. The impact is obviously distributed around a range of countries depending upon their political, social, and economic system. The important thing here is that the world's largest economies are slowing down. The euro area has been most badly affected, severely impacted by the gas and the energy disruption from Russia. China is suffering from pandemic-related disruptions, deepening of its downturn in its own property market, which is a major pull on its economy downwards. And momentum is slowing down here in the United States as well, as inflation is cutting into disposable income, wealth, and savings, impacting consumer demand. And higher interest rates are becoming a drag on new investments. So what's going on in the advanced economies is obviously spreading around emerging markets and developing countries, as they face obviously a reduced demand for their exports. And many feel the strains from high food and high energy prices that are coming from the West and the rest of the world. Another problem is a strong dollar, high borrowing costs, and capital outflows, which are causing triple blow to many emerging markets and developing countries. The probability of portfolio outflows, in fact, some recent estimates are saying from emerging markets over the next 3 quarters or a year has risen to almost 40%. That means you will see more money flowing out as the West is beginning to erode its savings and buffers. Now, this could pose more challenges to countries who are already facing large external financing needs, right? They are suffering, and this is a reason arising from the cost of living crisis, food, energy, and all the other expensive things that countries are importing from the rest of the world. Now, a point that is often forgotten is that at a national level, all this is having an impact on the social contract. The social contract means the understanding of mutual expectations that binds citizens and their governments for public services and protections against adversity. So this crisis has really strained social contracts in many, many ways. It has revealed weaknesses in health, education, social protection, and most clearly the disadvantaged marginal population and citizens at the margin. They have been affected much more than others. Here I mean that the poor, the vulnerable households have probably suffered the worst of health consequences. Children from poorer households have experienced larger educational losses. Not just urban, rural areas, the poorer students who were barely getting into schools have been shut, there have been lockdowns. Low-skilled, informal, female, and young workers have lost jobs. Another metric that will support what I'm telling you is that food insecurity is a pretty big problem at the moment. And almost 350 million people today are facing acute food insecurity, which could then result into, all kinds of problems. And obviously, it's a worrisome situation. And the combination of climate shocks and the pandemic and the regional conflicts have really disrupted the food flow that used to happen around the world with ease. Now, some people say, give them more money, give them more money. And one has to realize that more lending may not always be the best solution for every country. The crisis is actually adding to the high debt burden in many countries, and many very soon may find or are finding that they are going to be in an unsustainable economic fiscal path for a very long time. So the question is not just giving them money, the question is we have to come up with other international mechanisms. We have to look at nationally where they can cut their spending, where can they get more revenue. So it'll have to be a very interesting mix of adjustments, both at the global level and the national level.
So, sir, you spoke about prioritizing spending. So in light of that, I want to ask you, how does the outlook look? So is there, like you mentioned, inflation and interest rates are as two problems that we're facing right now, but is there clarity about the main policy priorities right now?
Again, that's again a very good question. Let me just sort of give you first the outlook and then come to the priorities. Look, the estimates at the moment are that countries accounting for about 1/3 of the global economy will experience at least 2 or 3 consecutive quarters of contraction during 2022 and 2023. So basically what we should be ready for based on current data, unless something extraordinary happens, so food disruption or supply shocks become okay, and then people again get too excited and then they again correct. Basically, from a pure economic point of view, we don't see anything that'll not lead to this contraction for some time. Even when growth is positive, our view is that it will feel like a recession. And that is because of shrinking real income and rising prices. So you see the point that even if there is a rebound of some kind, because of high interest rates, high inflation, in real terms, you will still feel as if you're in a recessionary situation. Overall, we are talking about a global output loss of about $4 trillion between now and 2026. And to just give you what this number means, about 4 trillion is about the size of the German economy, which is the fourth largest economy in the world. So you can see the aggregate output loss that we have to reckon with, and its distribution will be felt across these 190 plus countries in different ways. So basically it's going to get a little worse before it can get better. And in between, there will be some other economic shocks here and there that shouldn't surprise us. So a person like me, I'm always, whenever there's bad news that I read, I just put it in the context of all this that I'm trying to explain to you, because then I'm able to see why that is happening and what are the drivers. The new thing that, adding to the macro factors that are looking tenuous and fragile, financial stability risks are now beginning to grow rapidly. So, when this kind of a situation happens, you, I, anybody, we start sort of repricing and revaluing our assets on our balance sheet. Normal thing to do. But the problem is, if that process goes in a disorderly repricing, then it could amplify some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities. For example, high public debt. For example, illiquidity in some segments of the financial market. So here again, the balance sheet repricing and revaluation could lead to a problem, and we don't know what. So in this, I'm particularly sort of worried here about debt distress or the risk of it. It is a growing concern across everybody. In fact, more than 60% of the low-income countries and over 25% of the emerging market economies are sitting in a highly indebted position at the moment. They're not unsustainable, all of them, but it's pretty high. Now, in this context, yes, your question, policy priorities. The way I see it, they're becoming clearer by the day. So not by years. I think every day and during the day, the country authorities, policymakers, analysts, watchers, it's just getting clearer by the day. And I will mention 3 or 4 of them, which I think should give you a good sense on how the global priorities, these are global level priorities. Its translation into national priorities obviously will be different, right? The first priority at the moment is to combat inflation with all the policy muscle. I mean, we had thought early in the year that inflation will be transitory, but look, it's proved to be extremely stubborn and long-lasting. And some of the orthodox models and ways to forecast inflation have not really, stood up to time. At the best of the places, a lot of people say we missed it. The second is to avoid policy missteps, as the costs are enormous in the current conjuncture of so many eyes and so many shocks happening at the same time. And you all must be reading what's going on in the United Kingdom. I don't want to single it out, but I think it's the best example of the play of a policy misstep in a rather brutal manner. Yeah. So in a few weeks, the mismatch between fiscal and monetary policy spilled into the financial and capital markets. And now it has gone into the political pit of chaos, leading to a political resignation and again, political uncertainty. So in 3 weeks, UK has become a global case study of what policymakers must remind themselves that the luxury of doing what you want or being ad hoc in your decisions are probably over. Policy coordination, policy interactions, spilling over into markets, these are all happening almost instantaneously. So I just wanted to flag that as to when I mean to avoid policy missteps. This is probably the best example which is happening as we speak. The third is that while doing these two, the first two that I mentioned, one has to keep a balance between the policies. And this is more, it's a skill and an art, because there is frankly no science at the moment for various methodological data gaps. And it's work that economists and other analysts have to do more. But let me illustrate what I mean, the balance. Look, not tightening monetary policy enough would cause inflation to become de-anchored and entrenched. But this will require future interest rates to be much higher, which will cause harm, pain, and impact growth and people. Now, on the other hand, if you tighten the policy too much and too fast, and doing so in a synchronized manner across countries, as central banks are doing, it could push the economies into actual recession. So in the current environment, frankly, this balance is not easy. But one thing is clear, that while balancing, societies, markets have to realize that it will not be without pain in the near term. But then the key, the policy objective ought to be that let's avoid much greater and longer lasting pain for everybody. So pain there will be. The question is how long it lasts. And my last, before I close, and I shouldn't miss this, a policy priority is to support emerging markets and developing economies. So many countries need help to deal with debt, which has been pushed up, as I mentioned. Actually, more than a quarter of the emerging economies have defaulted or had bonds traded at extremely distressed levels. And over 60% of the low-income countries are already at the high risk of debt distress, leading to debt, I can't pay. So this raises the risk of widening debt crisis, which has really not happened in the scale that it should, because it's being kept controlled by so much of support from all around. But this is going to harm societies and people. So these are the 4 policy priorities.
That is a very insightful answer, sir. Now I want to ask you something personal. So as young students entering the professional workforce, hopefully soon, we are wondering if we should brace ourselves for a future of gloom and doom, given all the uncertainties that you just mentioned right now.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Look, I believe that Kautilya, your education, is actually preparing you to become more policy hardy, to see the trade-offs, and in fact, to become change agents who will then step out and help in this recovery at all levels: federal, state, community, village, international. So I know, no, I am not in that camp of gloom and doom. Also, I believe that one should always see the glass half full, unlike those who see the glass as not. Look, all that apart, if you look at a study of economic history, economic and financial crisis, I've done a lot of that. There's one clear lesson, that in every crisis, there is a silver lining for policymakers. And so is the case now. Let me illustrate. A lot of global capacity to manage what I said, polycrisis, has been tested. Actually, the pandemic provided an opportunity to showcase the value of government support and international standards. Many governments, as I said, when COVID hit, were able to protect their citizens' livelihoods through innovative response packages. It meant for the government and for the policymakers to come up with extraordinary actions that they didn't know about, to shield households to the extent they could. So this
True.
was vital. But remember that it doesn't come free. Huh? While they did that, the spending that the governments had to do almost reached 10% of GDP globally in the first 18 months of the pandemic. So that is one. Now, second good thing that is happening, where I see a positive line of hope, is that a very massive concerted focus is being given to indebtedness, to debt, especially of the low-income countries where, as I said, over 60% of them are already under debt distress. Sovereign debts have reached record highs in 2020, and they are projected to be at about 91% of the GDP globally this year. And accommodative monetary policy is pushing up prices for riskier assets. So there is a G20 common framework that came about 2 years back. It's in place to support debt resolution for low-income countries, but this process has to speed up a little bit. Another good thing that has happened is that the global safety net has got activated. You know, as I mentioned, that governments came, they spent a lot, but then, you know, governments have to spend from somewhere, right? So most of them have had to dip into their buffers. And that has increased the external pressures, foreign exchange. So in reaction to that, last year, they all got what is called the special drawing rights, which is a sort of a unit of account at the IMF, the last resort, that got distributed to all of them so that they have much more of strength and money in their balance sheets. A new food shock window was introduced, a rapid credit facility and a rapid financing instrument were used. So the global safety net all around has got tremendously activated. And the way I see it, it is sort of, its old orthodoxy is passé, it's gone. And the last good news for me is that this whole thing on global cooperation has got revitalized. The national authorities know that effective national level management has to be done in a manner that builds resilience at the national level against the shocks of the future. But that realization is also coming that I can't do it alone. The best it is done as a collective action, the better it is. So all the progressive nation states are realizing it and are seeking all kinds of partnerships. So basically a more proactive, precautionary mindset than in the past, more willingness to act now and act together. And the buzzword going forward is resilience. How to improve collective resilience of each other. And here I am extremely optimistic about the future. It'll be a modified world order, no question about it. And what will come out will be change. But change is not negative. Change is just different because it wasn't what you're used to. But change is a very good, it's a desirable thing to happen. And I think underlying this change are the advances done in sciences and technology. And I think those are going to be the strong two drivers to allow a smoother transition than some skeptics may be concerned about.
So, sir, you mentioned regarding...
I hope that this gives you some sense of hope and optimism, that it's not just gloom and doom. That's the one side of the story, but there's the other side of the story as well.
Cautious optimism.
Indeed.
Yeah. So,
more optimism with caution.
Than cautious. Yeah. Sir, so could you elaborate a bit more on the role of public policy in this?
So yeah, look, this triple crisis episodes have laid bare for both nation states and internationally what we can call the social, economic, and even political idiosyncrasies, including of the advanced economies. Much more has come out of this deep stress on where the problems are, right? And
Yeah.
clearly, this means that the policy side doesn't have to act, it has to decisively act. But in that, they have to found their decision-making on sound economics, data, and analytics.
Yeah.
So let me outline here a few areas where the role of public policy will have to be tested more than it has been tested. The first is infrastructure. And I'm not talking here about just physical infrastructure. We include social infrastructure here as well. So governments have to act now to somehow find ways to invest in basic public services. Remember, resilience. Resilience has to come from this infrastructure. Healthcare, education, physical infrastructure, social safety nets. On this crisis really brought out that many countries don't have a proper, fully funded social safety nets. So these additional investments from a policy point of view just can't be in an ad hoc way, let's do this here, let's do that, This has to be properly thought through and put into what is called some kind of a medium-term fiscal framework, so that you can see how the numbers come together. Remember, going back to UK wanted to test a few policies to stir growth, but when they came out, people said, fine, that's a good idea, but where is the money going to come from? And are you going to be borrowing more? And if you're going to go more, you're already sitting with huge amount of indebtedness, and so that's the circularity. So it's best if this thinking is done in the context of a medium-term framework. The second thing that policymakers have to do is to really work harder in generating and strengthening public trust, because without that, there will be no social cohesion. Remember, I mentioned about the social contract. I worry a lot about it. I mean, you have to come down from the macro into how it is impacting households and people. It is absolutely essential going forward that as this resilience is being built up, governments have to deliver and meet the demand of basic services in a more inclusive manner. That's another thing. Societies, you, me, everybody has been hit by this. And therefore, as we are coming out, we would expect something better and something improved. I mean, the argument is that people would be willing to pay taxes in return for reliable, high quality public services, and they're willing to pay something so that during bad times, the safety net is available. Otherwise, it gets very random and very costly. So even where the starting point is low trust in government, reallocating spending to services that citizens value, such as healthcare, education, can also help to build trust. So, this is where governments have to see where the mistrust is and what can they do to reignite their confidence in government spending, government's role. My third point where policy will get tested is on transparency. The generation that is now coming up, probably they more than the ones that are the millennials and the baby boomers, the Zs and the others, you guys, as you're coming up, you believe in the concepts of accountability. You say that, and this we're seeing globally, it's not just in your case, Kautilya's case, that takes example in budget formulation and execution. Where is the money coming from? Where is it going? Is it being properly spent? Are we getting value for our taxes? These kinds of questions are becoming extremely real in not advanced economies. This used to be a value for advanced economies, but today it is getting embedded in medium economies and lower economies. So the governments have to be fair and transparent in how they use public resources. That will be key. I mean, take public finances, just related to that. As I mentioned, the countries can use medium-term fiscal framework to make finances more sustainable and show how they can create space in the budgets to be able to sensibly allocate things over the medium term. And that space can then be used to reinvest in people, productive sectors. Again, I go back to health, education, and stronger safety nets. So too is the digital infrastructure to open doors to innovation, cutting edge digital government services that are more transparent and more efficient. There's a whole thing about e-governance, or, we are not talking, we're really talking about a lot of digital governance that comes about that allows this transparency to become much more a fact of life. So, there is that pressure that policy has to reckon with. I think we can take a lot of positive lessons from the fact that there are huge opportunities for policymakers, and they can really create lasting solutions and go back to reducing inequality, bring about durable growth, sustainable growth. But more importantly, since crises are now becoming a fact of life for all of us in combinations that we don't know, something else could happen in 5 years that we can't think of. But if we have some resilience, then I think as a group, as a community, as this planet, we'll be able to manage it better.
Thank you, sir. So aspiring policymakers like me will keep all the 3 issues that you mentioned in mind, and we'll try to work on it. So, sir, now let's move to another issue that you know very well and have done lots of studies and country work. That is financial stability. So nowadays, central banks and financial sector authorities, they routinely focus on pursuing policy objective of financial stability. But how has this policy space progressed through the years?
So, yeah, in this conjuncture or last 3 years, financial stability has been less spoken about because of the crisis being a very macro one. But it is currently under intensive watch. Financial stability is a policy area, we should remember, is a relatively young policy area. The global focus, the academia, researchers, central bankers, regulators, politicians have given financial stability as one of their objectives only in the period after 2008 global crisis. Now, it wasn't that before that there was always financial stability, but no, I think it just got codified into a body, and I'll explain to you why. But before I go there, a lot of people don't quite understand what is meant by financial stability. What is it about? What is this new policy about? What is this new policy trying to achieve, right? So, and this misunderstanding often, or not understanding very clearly, often leads to policy frictions, it leads to overlaps. My policy is more important than your policy, that kind of stuff. And obviously from the public side, they're totally lost what's going on. Now, I'll put it in a very simple way, because I think it's good that you understand and you relate to what I think is the most basic definition. There are a number of definitions, but in an operational sense, it's all about building a financial system that can function in good times as well as bad times, and can absorb all the good and bad things that happen to the economy in any moment. If it is skewed one way or the other, it's not stability. So it isn't about preventing failure. It isn't about stopping people or businesses from making or losing money. They should do it. That's part of the business. So it's just about financial stability policies are just about creating conditions where the system can work effectively in both the good and the bad times, right? So it all depends upon, there's a whole controversy whether financial stability is objective or it's a tool. Some people say financial stability is a tool towards a better financial sector. And some people believe that these policies have financial stability as an outcome. But regardless, sort of independent of getting there and getting caught in that debate, we should just remind ourselves that today financial stability has become an essential, necessary condition for the financial sector, and financial sectors in any economies are an important supporting sector to any other sector, all other sectors. There are two economic sort of motivations driving the birth and the evolution of financial stability. And allow me a minute to sort of expand, because it's important not just to understand, but to see where is this coming from, right?
Sure, sir, sure.
The first thing is that what we call cyclical financial stability risks, they arise as macro financial imbalances grow. They increase because either of greater risk-taking by lenders or by the borrowers. Now, these high imbalances can amplify negative shocks. And when they do that, then they create an adverse feedback loop. As prices fall and financial firms are forced to deleverage, it leads to a sharp decline in economic growth, conceptually. Now, this framework is based on a growing body of research from policymaking institutions and academia that explores macro financial linkages. So it's not just macro and it's not just financial sector. It's about how the two interact. And this interaction was frankly not properly understood or recognized until the global crisis took place, because that completely froze the financial system and it had an impact on macro. Remember, this crisis, it's the other way around, right? The financial system is reasonably better. You're not hearing anything about the bank failing and then creating a problem. The sector is becoming a shock absorber for exogenous. It's coming from outside. This is all leading to a new discovery, but that clearly means that you could have a loop either from macro into finance or from finance to the macro. So a lot of research in the last 10, 15 years, both at policy level and otherwise, is taking place on this interaction. The second reason why financial stability is such an important area, and more today than before, is what we call the degree of global or international financial integration. This has increased dramatically in the past few decades. And the result of that is that it is increasing correlations, as we call it, across countries. Something happening there happens there and happens elsewhere. And a lot of research now has established very clearly that these correlations are real. There is ample evidence that more the integration, more the interconnectedness, it then becomes a channel of transmission, an amplifier of shocks through international capital flows. So whenever you talk about international capital flows, one must remember this economics. It is able to move, but then it is also transmitting the good side as well as the risk side. So empirical studies of correlations of asset prices across countries, they find evidence of what is called contagion. Contagion is a term that policymakers in the financial sector try to mitigate or minimize. They can't eliminate it because, as I said, the new world is a network. But what they try to do is that movement of returns, which are not related to the macroeconomic fundamentals, they have to be properly monitored, and there should be policies and tools to manage them. So the integration, the interconnectedness, the transmission channels, and then finally, the complexity that is coming about through technology and financial services engineering, all leading to this more uncertainty. And, I've done some work on this and some of my other colleagues, and there are lots of very good research in this. There's overall uncertainty and nonlinear outcomes, which makes it worse from a policy point of view. Now, some tools and techniques are being used in this. For example, stress testing, you all may have heard, stress tests. Balance sheets are being stress tests. There is now what we call a macroprudential framework that has been developed Central banks or regulators have tools. There's much more being given on monitoring a set of indicators in a matrix. These are indicators which capture this macro financial imbalances across types of lenders and borrowers in a financial system. How do you assess asset valuations? The whole concept of leverage is very important. Hidden leverage, or sort of a derived leverage, or leverage is, the one that leads to this adjustment that a lot of agents have to make. Funding mismatches is another thing. In this crisis, again, actually what happened in London, sorry to go back, I know that very, very well, was because people said that, look, the interest rates in the long run are going all over the place. So anybody was sitting with what they call linkers. Linkers are long run government bond financing, bond-based financing, which is linked to inflation for 30, 50, 100 years. And pension funds were sitting holding it. And then they suddenly realized that they have to reprice. And there will be a huge, so they cut their losses, they started selling the gilts. And, what's happening is that very rapidly, countries are putting in place a framework for monitoring, not just in their country, but across countries, collecting data, sharing data, developing models that can actually help to manage these risks for the future so that they don't become unexpected sources of financial instability. By the way, there is a global assessment program on financial stability. I worked on it for 20 years, and that evaluates and let countries know from the policy side whether or not they have the right infrastructure in place. And if not, then they are suggested that these are the things that are missing in your framework that you need to bring into play. So let's as I said, it's young, it's important, it has become again a centerpiece in this crisis. And I hope we have another opportunity to expand a little bit more so that I can give you some practical examples of how financial stability policies work.
Yes, sir, we will have another opportunity very soon, hopefully, when we'll have you again on the podcast. But now this brings to the conclusion of our podcast. So, sir, finally, any closing thoughts or any advice for us?
Oh, well, I think I'll be a little humble in giving any advice because I'm myself learning, and I'm learning a lot from, from all of you, from everybody. Look, you have to recognize that there is much uncertainty about the shape of our future and the planet we live on. Okay? As I've said earlier, we can embrace this crisis as an opportunity and to craft a different but a better future together. To help lay the foundation for a strong recovery. Policymakers, young policymakers like you, your role will become very central on how the policy has to be responsive to the realities of each country, each society. It has to be local. It has to be federal. It could be international. No longer can you break the three. That's one thing that I have learned. Now, for that, we need a better understanding. So you have to see these trade-offs, the feedback loops, and always be hungry for data, and more data. And even where data is not available, policymakers must understand how to create proxies to come to a conclusion. So climate, digital, and the list is humongous. So let me conclude by saying that this is really a moment of test for our humanity. And I hope you and your generation can grow up so that the world can meet it with some sense of solidarity towards a more resilient world.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for giving us hope for in an uncertain tomorrow, as you mentioned. But thank you very, very much for coming on this podcast and giving us all these insightful answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I wish you and the podcast club and all those viewers who are watching this all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.